For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and culturally. Deep in the abyss of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other-than-human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. I invite you to go with me down the rabbit hole as I seek out the silenced, forgotten, buried, abandoned, and demonized stories and practices of regenerative, egalitarian, place-based cultures. There is still time to reconnect with what we have lost, to restore our broken relationships to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, and welcome to the Rewilding Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. I'm coming to you from Portland, Oregon, the traditional territory of the Multnomah and Clackamas Chinookan people, as well as the Kalapuya, Molalla, Cowlitz, and many other tribal groups whom have lived here, subsisted here, and traveled here to trade and make their living since time immemorial. The Rewilding Podcast is made possible through financial donations from patrons. Please consider becoming a patron and support the podcast. Today, I'm graced with the presence of Natasha Tucker from the Primal Anarchy Podcast, as well as the Black and Green Press. The way that we decided to do this was to make this two parts, and I will release part one here, the conversation between us on the Rewilding Podcast, and they will release part two on the Primal Anarchy Podcast. So you'll get kind of the best of both worlds, and you should also check out their other stuff. Take a listen.
So do you want to introduce you, and I'll say, and your podcast, and I'll say I'm visiting, or I'm like the representative from our podcast?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm cool. I'm
Love
Peter
it.
Michael Bauer, and this is a Mashup podcast. I'm the host of Rewilding Podcast, and my focus is on talking about, I guess, sort of many different aspects of what goes into non-agricultural societies, both before and after whatever this is that we're existing in today. I forget exactly my description on the website, but that's essentially what, to me, rewilding is sort of returning to non-agricultural ways of living in a basic way. Yeah, that's me.
And I'm Natasha Tucker, and I am co-host of the Primal Anarchy Podcast with Kevin Tucker. I'm excited that we get to interview each other today. That's kind of a fun idea. I do feel like interviews and the whole podcast thing can feel really awkward.
Oh yeah.
So it's nice to share a hot seat, so to speak.
Totally. Yeah.
But our podcast, obviously in our work too, deals with the whole idea of civilization being a force of destruction in the world, and that we are not our civilization, that there is life outside of the civilization, and that we are dedicated to doing the work to dismantling that system. And we used to use the term rewilding a lot. We don't use it so much anymore, but the sentiment is the same, that we are seeking ways to find life and happiness and authenticity in a world that is very much feels like it's crumbling more and more each day. So I'm happy to be here and chat with you about all this.
Yeah. It's funny. I think you mentioned this in Instagram or whatever when we were interacting about what to talk about. And I was thinking the same thing too. When you were visiting here for the Rewilding Conference like a year and a half ago, we were up late in my living room and we were talking about like, shit, we all thought this like civilization was going to collapse like 20 years ago. Like, what the fuck is going on? Like, when is shit going to really start speeding up? And then literally like 2 months later, the pandemic happened.
Totally. It's been such a strange time. And Kevin and I always laugh about coming out to visit you right at that moment, because first of all, our whole lives were changing, but then it was a really beautiful trip, like going to the coast and seeing the ocean, and then getting to talk to you and sort of like be all together in the same space. it was almost too much to take in. And then immediately afterwards, it couldn't even process, because it was
Oh
like,
yeah.
oh my gosh, like
Yeah.
something's really happening here.
Yeah.
So I do want to say too that I am on occupied Lenni Lenape and Susquehannock lands here in Pennsylvania. And I just want to make sure to say that, because I feel like we're also in this work very much in the midst of trying to figure out what it means to be part or descended from colonizer culture. And we're trying to navigate through that. And we're trying to figure out what unsettling means and what that looks like. And that's definitely part of our everyday work right now.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I know it's part of yours.
Yeah. My intro usually covers all the different names of folks that occupied these lands traditionally and still do today. But the Multnomah Chinook, Clackamas Chinook, Molalla, and Cowlitz, to name a few.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, yeah, it's been a really intense year, and it's nice to be able to reconnect now and kind of go from that space again. And I do still think that, I was just thinking about this earlier, like, what did I think the world was going to look like by 2021? I mean, in some ways, I think things are matching up. I thought that the climate would be,
right,
hugely upset. And I thought there probably would be things like pandemics. And I thought there would be a lot of suffering and, all different strains of uprising. And all of those things are happening, right? But then, like, here we are still sitting in these houses.
I know.
In your basement. I'm in my living room.
Yeah.
That was the part that I thought would look really different.
Totally. I kind of want to just jump in and ask you something, which I've been thinking about. I saw that you have like a landscaping business.
Yeah.
And, we do a lot of like wild tending stuff here. And I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts around land tending through the lens of Primal Anarchy? Because I know, like, when you all were here, you had the stickers, "All crops are bastards," which was fucking awesome and hilarious. And I'm like, and, at the same time, it's like, how do we go forward, if we have this concept of immediate return hunter-gatherers as sort of not necessarily the ideal life, but as an example of something that is like better than what we have today and probably what we lived in terms of our evolution and all of that. How do we reconcile where we're at now and where we'll be later in terms of like, our ideology of like, all crops are bastards, but then at the same time, like, well, but also we need to be growing things to like restore habitats or, eat food and all that kind of stuff. So what are your thoughts around that?
Well, I'm glad that you brought it up, because I was going to ask you along the same lines, because it's really in my mind right now, because I have been doing this work of ecological land care full time for about the past year, and really most of my adult life. That is what I have been doing as far as work goes, or making money, or just also just like for myself for the area that I live in. But it's such a point of conflict too, right? Because we have spent a long time thinking about the fact that agriculture is in many ways part of the system that is to blame for, I mean, literally destroying the ecosystems that we live in, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't get any better. Like, big ag just gets worse, and it just gets more toxic and more damaging.
Totally.
So, but at the same time, we're in this position of trying to get ourselves out of the system. So we're like in this space of resistance all the time. And the only way, still, I go around in my mind all the time on this. I feel like the only way, really, or like one of the only ways to resist in your daily life, is just to try to take yourself out of the stream of civilization. So, everything that we consume, basically, if you can find a way to step outside of that. And I'm not saying that that's going to shift the whole thing and make a difference and bring civilization down, but I do think in terms of our own well-being, it takes us out of the system a little bit, right? It puts us in almost like it puts us at a different speed. It slows things down. It connects us to the space around us. So, but again, I feel conflict over it. I feel conflict over growing annual vegetables. I feel conflict over coming into a space and, I call myself an ecological landscape designer. I feel conflict over coming in and saying, this is what I think should happen here. That's a really crunchy space to sit in. Like, I don't claim to know what the land needs as far as its health goes. I can only just work from like the tiny fraction of knowledge that I have acquired over time and apply it. So, and I was just joking with Kevin about this the other day. I was like, I kind of feel like as I go forward in this idea of like eco land care, that kind of thing, it's like my tagline should be like, I'm the shitty landscaper, because like I think really what we need to do is allow these containers to take place in our space, right? So like, instead of coming in and saying like, I'm going to put a meadow here and I'm going to do this in this like quick succession, I'm going, a lot of times people are using chemicals, right, to like clear the space, get this meadow going like in one season. I think probably what really makes a lot more sense is to tend it over time and over some amount of years, right? So like, we stop mowing, we watch what comes up. If those are native trees and shrubs and species that we want to be there, or if those are not so harmful species from other places that we want to be there, or that we think belong in that space or are doing well, then we sort of selectively harvest. Better if we harvest for use, right? Because then that sort of guides our hand. Or better if the natural world, so like other animals, that kind of thing, harvest for their use, because that guides our design hand. But I think honestly, the farther along I go, the more I just think, oh, we should just be here like making these containers, right? Like protecting these spaces, allowing things to function as they're going to, and then like lend a hand. Like, we're not here to like impose our will on the space. So
Yeah,
that's
totally.
kind of what's rattling around in my
Yeah.
brain right now.
I think that what you just said, impose our will, that this is kind of where I'm at in this weird, like it's not the actual etymology of the word wild, but in Miles Olson's book, Unlearn, Rewild, he makes the connection between willed and wild. And that to me sort of is the essence of this question of like, what is uh, the level of exertion of a will over something that then pushes it too far into domestication? Because a predator that is going to a cougar that's hunting a snowshoe hare is going to exert its will over the hare so that it can eat, right? It's not going to exert its will over every single one of them and overeat, right? It's just going to feed
Right.
itself based on its like own caloric needs.
Right.
And so I think about that in terms of like, where is the relationship to humans exerting our will, but not to the end of, everything? And
Right.
what is that relationship like? How do you stay wild and not end up domesticated? And we're already like in a position where we're so far into domestication that it's almost like everything that we do that is like a step backward from the direction of industrial agriculture is going to be a little bit less destructive. I don't want to say more sustainable, because it's not sustainable, but it's less destructive than whatever that thing is. But also thinking about, like what you said, that feeding yourself outside the system can be its own form of a resistance, because you have to, I mean, that's why our slogan for the Rewilding Conference was subsistence is resistance. The whole
I
point
like to
is
wear that shirt when I go to see my
awesome.
clients.
Nice. Yeah.
As a matter of fact.
Yeah. I'm wearing it right now, coincidentally, but yeah.
I was going to
um,
tell you that.
yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of where I'm at, just in terms of thinking about how do we, when I think about people that can actively resist civilization, it's mostly people who already have cultures that have a relationship to the land outside of civilization, right? Indigenous people who are subsisting off the land without participating in the economic, they're not getting their food from the grocery store, right?
Right.
And I think that's part of a network of larger scale resistance to states, is having a solid base of food. Like, where are you going to get your food? And I think psychologically, without that, it's almost like telling people to sink a boat that they're in without like having a life raft or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And so we
absolutely.
have to be able to have some sort of food system outside of the one we have now if we're going to feel like we can abandon it or take it down or dismantle it or whatever, right?
Right.
Um,
Well,
but yeah,
agreed.
I don't know
We're
the
like, yeah, we're so far outside the realm of subsistence right now, most of us, in the modern world, that I fail to see how we could make a leap, right, without gaining some knowledge and skills of different types of subsistence and just how to live when somebody is not handing you things in a package. I can't think of how that would happen, but it's a hard place to be in because I think you know we know that as soon as you get into a space of agriculture or horticulture even, sometimes is that immediately sort of changes your brain patterns to think differently about the seasons. It changes your brain patterns to think differently about storing food. There are so many things that happen to a culture when they move towards agriculture. But in this case, it feels like it is a step in the right direction. But I'm not committed to that.
yeah, yeah,
Maybe that's
exactly.
and something that I think is good to think about, right, is like, okay, we think these things. So many of us in this same movement think these things, and we need these tools, right, to extract ourselves from the status quo. But are we wrong? Like
Yeah,
maybe agriculture isn't a great stepping stone.
right.
Maybe planting and growing and trying to lean on that isn't a great idea.
Totally.
Maybe learning to hunt is a better idea. Maybe totally forgetting planting things like that at all. Like maybe that's the thing to do. But that's kind of a scary thing too, because at least learning to grow your own food or learning to forage or learning to like spread valuable seeds that are helpful for humans, that feels familiar at least, right? Like
Totally.
to what we can understand. And I think it's harder to think about a more drastic departure from that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's funny. I'm a renter, so I don't have
Same.
any property to grow on, right?
Yeah.
And I have, because of that, and because I don't know, I've never had like, I've had stable rent situations, but psychologically, because I feel like, oh, I could move at any time, I've never really gardened. And when the pandemic hit, I was like, okay, maybe this is it. This is my apocalypse house, regardless of me being a renter. And
Yeah.
so I did grow a garden here. And in doing so, I kind of had all these different sort of ideas around it that they kept coming back to this idea of resilience and adaptation, in that I thought maybe gardening would be more financially viable than buying food at the grocery store, but it turned out not to be, in terms of like the amount of time and labor plus water bills. Like, it basically ended up being the same or more to grow my own food. Um, and I kept thinking too about irrigation, and how I take it for granted that there's water coming out of the faucet. And,
Yeah.
all of the situations that could arise where water is no longer available. If there was an earthquake here, the Northwest is supposed to have a big earthquake at some point. If it just gets shut off, if it gets toxified, like there's a million things that could happen that could just turn the water off. And how many other people are relying on this water, right? And if there's a drought, we've never had a drought so bad that we can't water vegetables. They'll be like, stop watering your lawn, and you can get in trouble for watering a lawn. But what if you're somebody who gardens a lot and, you need all that water? Or what if there was a situation where there's a food shortage, like in World War II or something, and people need to grow victory gardens, but now we're in a drought and we can't actually get water from our faucets anymore to grow our food. Like, just all these things, and realizing how much just the idea of like, I'm going to grow my own food in a garden, like, it's still entirely reliant upon like this whole irrigation system of civilization,
Yeah.
and how much that relies upon like certain water filtration systems. And here in Portland, most of our water comes from a giant lake on Mount Hood, but Mount Hood is drying up, and so the lake is getting smaller.
Sure.
um and if the demand were increased and everybody was gardening, what would happen then? I don't know.
Well, exactly. And I mean, the other thing to consider is that annual vegetables are notoriously finicky. If
Totally.
you compare your annual vegetable plants to perennials, native perennials of your area, I mean, their entire structure and makeup is so different, and their root systems are so different, and they need so much more input and feeding and that kind of thing. I mean, I think just when you like think about that contrast, it makes more sense to lean at least towards more perennial food
Totally.
systems.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think, clearly there has to be some sort of delineation between, are we talking about annual vegetables? Are we talking about cucumbers and tomatoes, which are both delicious in their own right, but are what we're really talking about when we're talking about growing food? Are we wanting to move more towards perennial systems
Exactly.
based on shrubs,
Totally.
trees,
Yeah.
tree crops, that kind of thing? And obviously, and we are not the first people to say this, that's the direction that
Yeah.
makes more sense to go in, right?
Absolutely.
Um, but at the same time, if I feel kind of both ways about it. At the same time, if growing a tomato is the jumping off point that allows somebody to suddenly become interested in like what is happening in their backyard, then by all means, let me help you figure out how to grow that tomato. Like
Yes,
that
exactly.
feels like a really great compromise to me.
Totally. Yeah.
Um, but I think we know now that the systems that will probably last through floods, fires, droughts, that kind of thing, are ones that are based on sort of a woody system of perennials.
Totally.
And so that's where I have been trying to turn my attention in recent years.
Yeah, I think us too, with the greenhouse that we acquired. So Rewild Portland got a greenhouse in the fall, and then unfortunately it collapsed in the ice storm. So we
I
we now
saw
have
your
like
photos of that. I wanted to
yeah.
ask you about it. How did you get it repaired, and how is that project going for you guys?
Well, I mean, in the same vein, we want to grow native plants and perennials and things. Like, that's part of our mission, is to do native food bearing perennials and distribute them not just to community members, but also tribal groups that we work with and stuff like that. So, we're slowly kind of figuring out how we want to utilize this little space to grow food and plants that are native and get them out into the world. And so we bought this greenhouse, and then it collapsed almost immediately. I had started to get insurance on it, and we weren't there yet. So we lost,
Oh no.
um, yeah, we
I'm
lost the
sorry to hear
investment
that.
initially. Well, the good news is that the greenhouse company that manufactures them is going to give us a new one. So
That's awesome.
because we're a nonprofit, and yeah, they're just going to give us a new one. However, they want us to build it in certain ways, and we're kind of having a back and forth with them about that right now. But in the interim, I just built a bunch of hoop houses, and we grew some stuff in there, and had like a little spring plant sale, and then we're able to like make a little bit back to pay for that with the sale, and then we're able to give away a lot of food and medicine to different groups around Portland. But yeah, I think I have this, like, I read James Scott's Art of Not Being Governed through this sort of, even though he's just kind of like almost an ethnographer or something. I don't think he doesn't really project the critique onto the contemporary world, or offer any kind of
Right.
solutions or ideas. But I think in just reading that book through the lens of kind of like how we would sort of look at it as an instruction manual, like
Sure.
reading between the lines and figuring out those things, right? It's like the perennial foods are foods that evade taxation. So not only are they easier to grow and, um, also provide probably more calories because they're growing, they're like tubers and stuff oftentimes that grow underground. But they're not grains, so they basically make it challenging for tax collectors.
Right.
So that's when I read that, I was like, oh, that's a good idea. We should focus on perennial, underground starchy things.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, if you really think about if we're really talking about the food system as we know it collapsing, and we're going to have to like feed not only ourselves, but like little children and
Yeah,
people who are maybe like suffering from illness, it's like what we actually need to grow is really calorie rich,
totally.
very dense nutrition,
Yeah,
actual foods that can fill you
yeah,
up. Because
yeah,
grains, I think, like maybe we could say we can move away from grains, because
yeah,
grains
right.
take a lot of space, they take a lot of
Yeah,
water.
yeah,
You need kind of like a whole agricultural system to
totally.
make that work,
Yeah,
make enough food to feed people.
yeah,
So maybe we could say, hey, a great first step is like, let's forget about that, right? So then we have to figure out what are the most high calorie foods that we could grow without involving grains.
yep.
And that
And what
feels
are
like a
they?
good jumping off point.
Yeah,
Well,
which ones do you like the
what are
most?
they? Well, yeah, I was gonna say, what are they for you over here? I mean, I do still like the potato. I do still like the sweet potato. There is some great research being done around perennial potatoes. So that is a
Hmm.
possibility for the future, I think. I do love Jerusalem artichokes. They need to be prepared properly, but
Yeah,
that is a
yeah,
native sunflower, so
yeah.
it's to our area. So that's a great root crop. There are air potatoes that grow everywhere here, not native to this
What are
area,
air
but
potatoes?
they have a starchy tuber.
Huh.
Totally not native, but they have a starchy tuber, and they've got little potatoes that grow on vines. Can be kind of a troublesome invasive, but if you eat them, you're kind of interacting with them in a different way. So I think we have to be careful too when we are really furious about non-native plants coming into our areas, because maybe there's a solution there as far as managing those
Totally.
species
Yeah,
and also feeding ourselves.
exactly. Yeah.
Um, so those are some going on here, and there are many others. But how about in your area?
Yeah, I grew some potatoes last year, my first foray into growing potatoes.
Hmm.
I think French fries were a staple for me for a long time. So, trying to like figure out how to grow potatoes, it's one of my favorite things. Also, I read it's one of the highest satiating foods. So it makes you feel full, which is cool. And it also has, yeah, lots of nutrients and stuff in it too. But here in the Northwest, there's actually two different indigenous potatoes, and they think that they were traded up the coast probably like over 500 years ago, and then grown and naturalized in the environment. So there's actually a Tlingit potato and a potato called the Ozette potato.
Wow.
Ozette is a Makah village site just south of the tip of the Olympic Peninsula. It's also the Ozette village site is the largest like Native American archaeological site, I think, in North America. If you've ever had a chance to
Wow.
go there, it's amazing. It's kind of like a Northwest Coast Pompeii. It was basically a village that was completely covered in a landslide like 1,000 years ago. And then in the 1970s, just started like another landslide happened and it exposed the village. And they found over 50,000 artifacts that were basically completely preserved
Wow,
without
that's
any real
incredible.
decay. So super cool museum too. If you ever go to McCawland and want to support them, the museum is just amazing there. But
That sounds amazing.
yeah, so the Ozette potato is something I was going to grow this year and then kind of failed to get that going. But
Hmm.
in my yard, it's filled with an invasive species called lesser celandine.
Yeah, we
And
have that all over here too,
okay,
with
cool.
the
Yeah, I
little with
looked
the
it up.
rhizomes. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
I looked it up online and it was like, I was actually in Master Gardener's class right before the pandemic. And they were like, oh, this is a terrible weed. Here's what you can do. Spray it with this thing and dig it up. And I was like, I raised my hand. I was like, does anybody know if it's edible or medicinal or something? And they're like, oh no, it's terrible. And I just like opened my laptop in the class and Googled like, can you eat lesser celandine? And it was like, yes, it's a delicacy in Ireland or something.
Right.
And so I tried to find information about how to prepare it and stuff. And there was just nothing. And then I was recently watching a Ray Mears bushcraft episode on YouTube or something. And he's like, this plant is celandine or whatever, and he's like digging it up. And I was like, oh shit. And he like roasts it in the coals and then pops it open. And I was like, oh, once I could see the bulb in his hand, because I tried digging up what I thought was the rhizome and it wasn't. Like I wasn't digging deep enough. It was just part of the like root stock or something coming up from the rhizome.
Because they make like a little mat like close to the surface, which is how they
totally
sort of cancel out other plants from
exactly
growing. Yeah.
But the actual little edible starch is like deeper down in those like clusters of bulbs or whatever, right? And so then he just like roasts them in the coals and he eats them and they're like, oh, they just taste like peanuts or potatoes or something. And I realized there's a native plant called yampa, and it looks exactly like the bulbs look exactly the same size, same everything, and you can cook it in a fire. You can actually eat yampa raw. But I was just like, oh, this is like an invasive yampa,
totally.
like I can just dig this
eat
up.
It. Like,
yeah, exactly.
And I know that there are a lot of people saying like, eat your invasives, right? But then, this is very frustrating to me. There's the whole world of people who are real sticklers for native plants, right? And these two categories of people are like not coming in contact with each other.
Yeah, I know.
Like the people who are stickler for natives are just like, tear everything out, spray it with poison and put in natives. Yeah. And then the people who are like, we need to forage and like use these things to feed our communities and that'll, sort of solve like a bunch of problems at one time. For some reason, there's just not enough sort of like interconnection between these different groups of people that are interested in all this. And I find it really frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like a large part of it is that whole and like the war on invasive species that Monsanto propagated after World War, or, after Vietnam and World War I or II, I mean, where they wanted to sell more chemical weapons. And so they invented essentially invasive species. I mean, it was an idea before, but it wasn't like the prevailing idea of ecological systems.
It's been very effective.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of the grants that you can get for like, conservation or taking care of land in your area, built into those grants, which a lot of people don't know, is that you have to use a certain amount of chemicals, that those are funded by the big chemical companies, and it's already built in. So, which is really pretty terrifying.
Yeah.
So it is. I think, we have to be aware of what's going on, and we have to be aware that so much of the narrative around everything that we sort of like consume in our culture is produced by one company or another trying to make $1, right?
Totally.
So I think part of our work now in unsettling and like seeing through these things is like what is actually happening? What is the actual story?
Yeah.
Instead of just paying attention to the narrative or paying attention to whatever it is that's like easiest to grab onto and consume. But that job feels like it's also like never even like it's like you can't make a dent in it.
Yeah.
Because everything that we talk about is like shrouded in lies and deceit.
Yeah. I emailed the Master Gardener program afterward and I said, hey, I run a nonprofit. We teach invasive species. They were doing like online Zoom seminars and stuff. And I was like, I would love to write and produce like a 2-hour video on the top invasive species in Portland and how you can, harvest them and eat them for food and medicine. And they were just like, no. I was like, what? How could you they were just like, no.
Like,
I mean, that's basically, and I was like, okay, why? And they were like, because no. They're like, it's our policy. No. And I'm just like, okay, so you're just telling people to spray them with chemicals, dig them up manually or spray them with chemicals. Like, what the fuck is wrong with you?
It's really, it's really, really frustrating. And I really think that those of us, because I think we can say like, this is a part of this rewilding process, right? It is a part of this examining civilization and trying to remove ourselves from this like machine that we're sort of like locked into. But we have to be really careful about it because like what's being handed to us is like just really like wrapped and shrouded in some really like awful toxic practices that need to be discontinued like
Oh yeah.
immediately.
Yeah.
Like we cannot say that we're a conservation group and go in and spray acres of land, like many acres of land with these, you know, pesticides and herbicides. They're endocrine disruptors.
Right. Exactly.
They're cancer causing.
Yeah.
We know that they are. We're no better as conservationists or whatever it is that you want to call us than the agriculture system
Right.
if we're going in and
Yeah.
applying the same principles.
Yeah.
But the hard part is, and this past year I had the chance to work on like designing and installing some riparian buffers in our area, which like takes place over a really like large amount of acres, right? And along sensitive waterways and whatnot. The problem is that the grants that are available for a lot of this work don't cover the real price of the labor to
Totally.
do the work without
Yeah.
the chemicals.
Exactly.
So we're stuck really like in between a rock and a hard place of like, okay, pretty much those of us that are aware of that the climate is changing and that we need to make moves in this way, right? Like we know we need to do the work. We know what the work that needs to be done. We can come together. We can make those things happen. But the funding that is available doesn't cover the work in a way that is supportive of the ecosystem. So what do we do? Like, how do we move within that system? Or do we not move within that system? You know, what's the what?
Totally. Yeah. I have this like suspicion that as we descend from, with diminishing returns, that food becomes scarcer and harder to get and has to become more localized. And so I have this sort of like backup plan in my head because I live in an urban environment and I'm just economically stuck here. There's no way I could move away or whatever. There's nowhere left to run. So I'm going to die here, like rewilding as much as I can in an urban context or whatever. Right. But there's one day I was like walking down the trail at a park in Portland and I was eating lemon balm, which, is invasive and was growing all over the trail. And coming back the other direction, our parks employees spraying the lemon balm and we crossed paths. Right. And as I'm crossing, I just got so fucking mad. And I'm like, how is the labor? So they think that they need to spray this instead of like hiring people to pull it out. But the majority of these species have medicinal or edible qualities or craft qualities, right? So why not have like neighborhood guilds that manage these spaces? And like, instead of having, 4 employees go around and spray lemon balm, have one person that's paid by the city be a neighborhood coordinator and one person be like a medicinal plants instructor. Hire people, not hire, but like have people from their own community come and harvest all the lemon balm and like turn it into salve. And I guarantee that is going to be less money. I mean, and I guarantee that's going to be less money than buying a bunch of chemicals, and it's going to be healthier, right? But and you could do that with every single species that needs to be quote unquote managed. You know what I mean?
My concern is, though, if that's not already happening in Portland, then the rest of us are doomed.
Portland is so fake. Don't believe any of the hype about Portland being sustainable. It's just not true. It's a myth.
No, for real, that makes so much sense. That makes so much sense. And then I just wonder, like, what is the next step, right? Like, so many of us have these ideas and so many of us are doing the actual work to put these ideas into motion and get them going at the ground level, but it feels slow. It feels cumbersome. It feels exhausting. It feels like burnout is imminent for everybody that's doing it, right? So my question is, what to do? Like, we have to move faster, right? Like climate change is telling us we have to move faster. And how do we do that?
I mean, I think it's just social. Everything has to be social and not on the internet. I mean, like in real life, right? Like the part of the in terms of diminishing returns, you have less connections, less, bureaucratic connections that span distances. So in terms of our own collapse, that's going to look like, food systems shrinking. We're not going to be able to ship bananas, right? So I think that there's this level of socialization that we need to, that the fastest way to get to that kind of thing is actually to organize. Like the actual park that I was walking in, that I was eating the lemon balm that was being sprayed, that park exists because in the 1970s here in Portland, they were going to turn it, it was an industrial waste site, and they were going to turn it into a motorcycle track and like a racetrack for motorcycles. And the neighborhood
So funny.
people banded together and started putting up signs in the park that said, Oaks Bottom Wildlife Refuge. And it wasn't a refuge,
So
right?
great.
It was a garbage dump. And they fought and sat in trees and, made it happen. And we now have Oaks Bottom. It's a beautiful refuge for birds. It still is to this day. And they were going to drain it and turn it into a motorcycle, drain the swamp.
Oh my gosh. What a
And
story.
yeah. And so in the same way, I think that there just needs to be that social capital. There needs to be people who are literally like knocking on doors, right? And being like, hey, I'm going to host this thing and we're just going to do it. We're going to go harvest lemon balm. And in the same way, that they just put up signs and they just made it a park. There's a level of the bureaucracy of Portland, the city of Portland, that can't change fast enough for what we need.
Right.
And while I like to work with them and we partner with them for certain things in terms of education, I would implore citizens, whatever that means, I would implore people who live in the vicinity of these natural spaces to band together and stop, to advocate to stop spraying these and to start utilizing the resources that we have here, the kinships that we have with other than human species, not resources in that sense, but, relatives, and how we can work with those species instead of spraying them with chemicals. And I just feel like the way to speed it up is to make as many friends as possible and like basically throw parties, right? Like we're going to throw a lemon bomb party. Like that's like,
Yeah.
oh, no, oh, we're going to have a work party. That doesn't sound fun. We're going to have a medicine making party. That sounds fun, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a
Agreed.
level of like flipping the narrative and being like, no, this is actually what we're doing is creating resilience. We're bringing each other together and we're just making medicine, with this stuff instead of, but now, obviously it's been sprayed with glyphosate, or this was years ago, but that's
Right.
going to be latent in the soil now all over the parks. I mean, that's the other kind of problem with this stuff, with invasives and in general, and consuming them, is how long are these chemicals inside them, in the soil, all the things. And I mean, are we like urban raccoons processing all of the toxic chemicals out, or the
I
wolves
well,
of Chernobyl, and
I mean, we kind of are. I mean, the cancer rates are through the roof.
yeah.
And actually, that I think something that we were saying when we were talking about setting this up is you said something about health, or how do we sort of like sustain ourselves? Like, what does that look like? How do we feed ourselves calorically? What really do we need to be healthy and to be able to sustain ourselves long term, right? Even outside of the system. And then I started thinking about something that I think about a lot is like, at this point, right? If we are immersed, like we're basically bathed in all these different compounds all the time, right? From a million different sources, like the air, the water, everything. Um, like, what does health look like right now? Is it
Yeah.
possible to be
Yeah.
healthy?
Right.
And it's like something that there's so much like advertising around it. This is going to make you healthy. This is going to make you feel better. This is try this, try this, try this, try this. And it's like, maybe we just need to stop for a minute and say, the core of the issue here is that our ecosystems are
Exactly.
totally threatened,
Yeah.
and that they're under attack, and that they're collapsing, and that maybe none of these things are going to make us feel better
Totally.
because we're
Yeah.
organisms that are part of something larger.
Yeah.
So like, I kind of think we're stuck in this crazy cyclone of like, this is going to make me feel better, I'm going to go jogging and I'm going to feel better. And it's like, guys, like, just stop. We don't feel better because we're not like individual creatures.
Exactly.
We're connected to everything else.
Exactly. I hope you enjoyed the first half of our conversation together. You can hear the second half over at primalanarchy.org. You can also check out Natasha's work at natashatucker.org. If you'd like to support the Rewilding Podcast, become a patron on Patreon. Patrons receive the podcast 2 weeks before anyone else, as well as other content, including an audio commentary on Rewild or Die, my first book, read chapter by chapter with contemporary commentary, reflection, and criticism. I also offer a patron prompt, wherein patrons can ask me a question that I will answer on another podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.